Perpetua was a noble woman, a Roman noble lady. And so she would have been named before Felicitas. But it is not the same Felicitas. This Felicitas was the mother of 7 boys who were all taken from her and put to death before her eyes. Because she and her family would not renounce Jesus Christ. And so to get her to renounce Jesus Christ, they said, we're going to kill your boys. And you know what she said? My sons, look up to heaven where Jesus Christ with his saints expects you. Be faithful in his love and fight courageously for your souls. In other words, she just told her boys, don't you give in. You're going to be martyrs. You're going to go to heaven. Don't give it up. Don't give up the faith. And every last one of them courageously died for the Catholic faith. Poor Felicitas, that torture must have been worse than anything. That would have been worse than being killed yourself, to have your 7 boys all killed in front of you. She was finally martyred 4 months after them. 4 months later, she was beheaded for the faith. So she is the first woman named in the Mass, and she is the mother of martyrs. One of the most courageous and good women you'll ever read about in the annals of the saints. And then comes Perpetua. And the church doesn't wish you to forget about Felicitas either, but you are expected to think of the other slave Felicitas when you think of Perpetua. This Perpetua was a young woman, a noble girl. She was married, and she was pregnant. And she and her slave were taken from her house in this is the year 202, so it's 100 years before Peter and Marcellinus. As I told you, the church has this ranking. So even though it's not in chronological order, Peter and Marcellinus were killed almost 100 years after her. So then they go to name the women. And anyway, Perpetua was killed in the year 202 under Emperor Severus. I think that was his name. But anyway, she and her slave girl were taken to the Roman Colosseum and were imprisoned first. And all the time she was in prison, her father, who was pagan, her 2 brothers were Christian, had converted. Her mother was Christian, Catholic. And she had a brother who was pagan, and her dad was still pagan. He came every day to beg her to come out of prison. And he wept. And to see her father weeping for her, it tore her up. And she didn't know what to do. She just had to pray for her dad. And she tried to console him and tell him, Dad, I'm going to a better place. Anyway, Perpetua had her baby in prison. She gave birth in prison. And her father asked her to, for the sake of her child, to come out. So he kept pleading with her. And he told her that no one's going to be able to take care of this child. And poor Perpetua, she could not bear to see her father begging for her to come out of jail all the time. But now she has this little baby that she wants to live for. But she knows she's not going to be able to. And it shows you the great heroism of this young woman. As she gave up that baby, she just gave her little baby away and asked some Christians to raise her child for her. She knew she would never get out. She had a vision, though, in prison of her brother who had died. And it's interesting because it's one of the earliest references to purgatory. She has this vision of her brother unable to drink from the fountain of this beautiful fountain in a garden. And it was such a beautiful place, but he was unable to reach the fountain. And he was dying. He looked like his His face was deformed, and he looked hideous. And in the vision she had, she was so worried about him. And she realized that it must be that he's suffering in purgatory. And so she prayed for him. And she got everyone else to pray for his soul. And she had another vision where she saw him in happiness in heaven, drinking from that fountain. So it gave her the courage to go on. God comforted her in her hour of darkness. She and the slave girl, Felicitas, were thrown to wild cows. Sounds kind of strange, but they were thrown to wild cows to mock the fact that they were women, not to bulls, but to cows. But these cows were wild, so they charged after the girls, and they gored them and threw them up in the air. And Perpetua got tossed up in the air by the horns of this cow and came crashing back to the earth, and her dress was all torn. And it just shows you what kind of girl she must have been. The first thing she did as the cow is charging her to kill her, she's laying on the ground. She took her skirt and she covered her legs up, sitting on the ground, bleeding and suffering. She covered herself up because she was so modest. Well, it so happened that they didn't die. And the soldiers come to take Perpetua and Felicitas away because, the cows got tired or whatever. And the people just said, let them go, let them go. The people were saying, enough, enough. And so they take the girls out. And as Perpetua is leaving the arena, she turns to the soldier and she says, when are we going to face the wild cows? And the soldier looks at her like, you just did. And Perpetua's like, really? And it shows you, it's a little thing in the lives of the saints that shows you that in the midst of your greatest torments, God is so with you. He is so much with you to comfort you and help you that you won't even feel it. Remember Lawrence? When St. Lawrence was grilled over the fire, he made jokes. He didn't even feel it. It's only possible because God gave them that strength. And he gave it to Perpetua. I'm running out of time, but really, just very quickly, the next two girls are Sicilians. And they're so closely related, even though they're 50 years apart. Agatha was a beautiful Sicilian girl, and Lucy was a beautiful Sicilian girl. Agatha died in, I think, 253, and the judge heard, he was a governor, he was the governor of Sicily, and he heard about this beautiful Christian girl. And he heard that she was rich and she was beautiful. And so the governor basically said, marry me and you'll get your freedom. And she said, no way. And so she preferred death to dishonor. And forgive me for saying this. I know it's hard to say these things sometimes, but he ordered her breasts to be chopped off. And it was a torture that would not kill her, but it was in hatred for her rejection of him. And he also wished to deform her and take away her beauty. And she suffered this. And so she's the patron saint of women who have breast cancer. But in the middle of the night, St. Peter the Apostle appeared to her and healed her. So that the next day she was restored. And no one understood. The soldiers couldn't figure out what had happened. They thought maybe she hadn't gone through the torment or something. But anyway, she was eventually beheaded. She died in prison.